Imagine dying not by a sword, not by poison, not even by betrayal. Imagine dying from eating too much dessert. It sounds like black comedy, right? But in icy 18th century Sweden, that's exactly what happened. The scene wasn't written by a sarcastic playwright or a reality satire screenwriter. It was pure, unvarnished history. And its main character was Adolf Frederick, King of Sweden, who passed into eternity not for his political achievements, but for his final meal. On February 12, 1771, at a table illuminated by silver candelabras, the monarch enthusiastically gave himself over to his favorite gastronomic ritual, a royal winter dinner. The menu included lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, cabbage soup, boiled veal, champagne, and, as if that weren't enough, 14 servings of his favorite dessert, semlor, a Swedish bun filled with almond paste and cream soaked in hot milk. Yes, 14. Not a scribe's mistake. Not an exaggeration by a witness. 14 servings of dessert. And he wasn't a robust man, nor a Nordic Hercules with an athletic build. He was a 60-year-old king of rather frail constitution, prone to illness. His stomach simply gave out. He died that same night. The official cause, digestive complications worsened by a fatal indigestion. In modern terms, his system exploded. But the most tragic or ironic part of this story is that Adolf Frederick, up until that moment, had been practically a decorative king. He wielded little power. He was neither passionately loved nor hated. He was a constitutional monarch who signed papers, smiled for portraits, and hoped no one would stir up too much trouble in Parliament. His death became his most memorable act, as if history had turned him into the living symbol of sterile excess. But who was this man before he sat down at that fatal banquet? Adolf Frederick was born on May 14, 1710 in Stockholm, the son of Duke Frederick of Holstein-Gottorp and Princess Sophia Dorothea of Sweden. From childhood, he was a frail child, delicate in health and quiet in temperament. He was never meant to reign. His cousin, King Charles XII, held the throne and shaped history with a firm military hand. Adolf grew up more like a secondary nobleman, without great expectations. His education was typical of nobility. He studied languages, history, etiquette, and religion, but never showed passion for power or politics. Rather, he was described as a reserved, kind, and sometimes melancholic man. The years that followed were marked by instability in Sweden, wars, dynastic changes, and a monarchy in decline. When Charles XII died without heirs in 1718, the royal family fragmented, and the Swedish nobility sought a new king in the figure of Adolf Frederick, not because he was a charismatic leader or brilliant strategist, but because he was the safest option to maintain balance between political factions. Thus, in 1751, at age 41, Adolf Frederick ascended the throne, not with a burst of jubilation, but with a resigned sigh. His reign was a mix of ceremony and limited control, as real political influence lay in the hands of Parliament and the nobility. Where does the gluttony that led to his death fit into all this? From a young age, Adolf Frederick showed a certain fascination with food. In a court where boredom was constant and power was a distant game, culinary pleasure became a tangible source of satisfaction. Food was his refuge, his comfort, and his way of filling voids that the crown could not fill. His doctors already warned about his tendency toward indigestion and stomach problems. Yet the king eagerly indulged in lavish banquets, especially in winter, when palace life became heavier and colder. Over time, this fondness became a dangerous habit, a silent act of rebellion against a powerless life. That February night in 1771, gluttony was the final expression of a man who never found his place in history. but did find it on his plate. When Adolf Frederick took the throne in 1751, Sweden was no longer the feared power it had been in previous centuries. The country had gone through decades of conflict that eroded its influence and prestige. Sweden's golden age, marked by the era of Gustavus Adolphus in the 17th century, was now a distant memory. By the 18th century, true power no longer rested with the monarch, but with a strong aristocracy and the parliament, the Riksdag, which controlled the nation's reins. This relegated kings to a ceremonial rather than effective role, creating a sense of frustration for a man who wore the crown, but not sovereignty. Adolf Frederick, a rather apathetic and calm king, had to navigate a sea of tradition and pressure without real authority. In the palace halls, major political decisions were made without his consent, or often behind his back. His role was limited to signing documents and appearing at ceremonies, while the nobility and ministers debated Sweden's future. This power vacuum created an atmosphere in which the figure of the king lost strength and meaning. The crown, once a symbol of absolute power, had become a heavy ornament, a burden without glory. For Adolf Frederick, this was not only a political issue, it was deeply personal. The crown atop his head was a constant reminder of what he lacked: control, respect, and above all, purpose. In this atmosphere of disillusionment, the monarch found refuge in food. Banquets became sacred moments where power was his, even if fleeting. At the table, he could dictate his own rules: how much to eat, when, and what, without anyone else giving orders. The palace kitchen rose to meet this need. Sweden, even in decline, maintained a rich and abundant culinary tradition, especially in winter, when food became a celebration against darkness and cold. Opulent dishes, many imported and others made with local ingredients, adorned the royal tables, from fresh lobster and imported caviar to fermented sauerkraut, smoked herring, and sparkling wines. This contrast between a powerless crown and a powerful feast caused Adolf Frederick to develop an obsessive relationship with food. Beyond pleasure, eating became a way to fill the void left by his political impotence. Each bite was a small victory, a way to affirm that, at least at the table, he remained king. But this indulgence came with consequences. The royal physicians warned that the king suffered from chronic digestive issues, and that his lifestyle endangered his health. Yet these warnings were ignored or downplayed by a man who saw food as his last domain. Tradition also played a crucial role. In 18th century Sweden, the crown symbolized continuity and stability. Though the king lacked real power, the court expected appearances to be maintained. Banquets and feasts were not just occasions for pleasure. They were rituals reminding society that the monarch was present and in control, even if only over the table and the feast. This scenario created a kind of tragic contradiction. The king was surrounded by powerful lords and parliamentarians, yet his only domain where he could truly reign was food. This paradox fueled his gluttony and his loneliness. At the heart of this story is also the pressure from family and nobility. Adolf Frederick came from a noble line, the House of Holstein-Gottorp, a foreign branch with few supporters in Sweden. His marriage to Louisa Ulrika of Prussia was more a political alliance than a passionate union. This relationship added internal and external tensions, along with expectations about the continuity of the dynasty. The stress of maintaining a dignified image and fulfilling the traditional roles of king and husband likely influenced his habits. Food, with its abundance and ritual, became an escape and a way to cope with the invisible pressure surrounding him. Thus, in a Sweden dominated by political shadows, among powerful nobles and a strong parliament, Adolf Frederick lived out his royal existence, where power was an illusion and food was the only tangible reality. This combination of frustration, tradition, and gluttony set the stage for the ending everyone remembers: an excessive banquet, a dinner that turned fatal, and a king devoured by his own indulgence. On February 12, 1771, the royal palace of Stockholm was preparing for one of those dinners that seemed routine at first glance but were destined to be marked in history by their tragic outcome. Adolf Frederick, the king who had spent years living in the shadow of power, sat at the table with a calm gaze, perhaps unaware that this evening would become his last. The servants and cooks, experts in preparing feasts for nobility, had arranged a particularly elaborate menu for that cold winter night. It was a display of Swedish court opulence and a reaffirmation of royal status. The food was more than nourishment. It was symbol, power, and tradition. The menu included fresh lobster, a costly delicacy rare in the cold northern waters. Caviar, imported and prized, glistened in small quantities, reserved for discerning palates. There was also sauerkraut, a traditional fermented cabbage, offering a sour flavor and crisp texture to the feast. Smoked herring completed the banquet with its intense, salty taste. Cabbage soup, boiled veal, and champagne rounded out a varied and abundant gastronomic tableau. Each dish played a role in the experience. Each bite was part of a ritual that exalted the wealth and power of the crown. For Adolf Frederick, every such meal was a small celebration, an opportunity to feel he had control over something in his life. But the climax of the night came with dessert, the semlor. These sweet buns filled with almond paste and cream, soaked in hot milk, were his weakness, a Swedish tradition that, for the king, represented luxury and pure pleasure. That night he ordered no fewer than 14 servings of his favorite dessert. 14, a number that may seem absurd today, but which at the time reflected far more than appetite. It was an act of indulgence bordering on obsession. The king devoured bun after bun, ignoring the warning signals from his body and the advice of his physicians, who were already aware of his digestive issues. The combination of such a heavy meal, rich and fatty dishes, and the excessive amount of semlor proved lethal. As the night wore on, Adolf Frederick began to feel unwell. He complained of pain and discomfort, but the dinner remained the center of attention at court. The figure of the king had to remain firm, showing no weakness. Eventually, the discomfort became unbearable. Doctors arrived quickly, but the damage was already done. It is believed he suffered from severe indigestion, possibly acute pancreatitis or intestinal blockage, worsened by the quantity and variety of food consumed. He died that same night in the royal chambers, a victim of fatal gluttony. His frail body could not withstand the excess, and his story was forever etched into the annals of history as the most unusual and tragic death of a monarch. But this death, beyond being a curious or anecdotal episode, reveals much about Adolf Frederick's personality and the context in which he lived. A man trapped in a powerless role, who sought in culinary pleasure a way to assert his presence and satisfy an emotional void. His passing shocked the court and the country. Although politics continued without him, his story became a symbol of the excesses and contradictions of 18th century Swedish monarchy. The death of Adolf Frederick on that cold February night in 1771 left Sweden in a state of uncertainty. The king, who died from an excessive meal, had closed a peculiar chapter in the nation's history. But his death was not merely the end of a life marked by gluttony and lack of power. It also marked a crucial moment for the Swedish monarchy, immersed in a sea of political and social tensions. Adolf Frederick left behind a divided kingdom and a weakened crown. As previously mentioned, power in Sweden had been in the hands of the Riksdag, the parliament, since the so-called Age of Liberty began in 1718, following the death of King Charles XII. This period was characterized by a significant reduction in royal authority, shifting from absolute monarchy to a constitutional system where nobility and bourgeois classes held political control. King Adolf Frederick, for all his majesty in portraits and official ceremonies, was more of a decorative figure than a true ruler. Therefore, his death did not leave a power vacuum in the traditional sense, but it did spark a desire for change among those longing for leadership. His son, Gustav III, ascended the throne amid a country crying out for guidance and stability. Gustav III inherited not only the crown, but the heavy burden of restoring dignity and respect to the monarchy. At just 17 years old, the young king had a clear vision: to revive royal prestige, strengthen the crown, and return Sweden to its former glory. Gustav III's reign marked a dramatic turning point in Swedish history. This charismatic and cultured monarch was everything his father was not: decisive, cunning, and deeply purposeful. He understood that to reclaim power, he had to use both politics and symbolism. He revived theater, opera, and the arts, transforming Stockholm into a vibrant cultural center, reflecting his ambition for greatness. But his efforts were not limited to culture. Gustav III promoted reforms aimed at weakening the power of the Riksdag and centralizing authority under the crown. In 1772, he staged a coup that partially restored absolute monarchy, marking the end of the Age of Liberty and the beginning of a new era known as the Enlightened Monarchy in Sweden. The transition from the reign of Adolf Frederick to that of Gustav III was neither simple nor free of conflict. The nobility, accustomed to its privileges, resisted change and conspired against the young king. However, Gustav III, with a mix of diplomacy and determination, managed to consolidate his power and establish a new order. This transformation was not only political, but also symbolic. The image of the monarch shifted from that of a powerless, gluttonous ruler to that of a strong, cultured leader, determined to guide Sweden toward a better future. The death of Adolf Frederick, with its tragic background, served as a warning and a lesson on the dangers of indifference and lack of purpose. Moreover, the Swedish court, once marked by the luxury and opulence favored by Adolf Frederick, was transformed by Gustav III into a stage where culture and politics intertwined to project power and legitimacy. His reign would be remembered for the flourishing of the arts and the consolidation of a more active monarchy, although it too would face its own tragic fate. Thus, while the country was still recovering from the loss of such an unusual king, it was preparing for a chapter filled with tensions, reforms, and above all, a struggle for the very soul of Sweden. Gustav III, the son of the king who died from overeating, ascended the throne with an energy and determination that sharply contrasted with the shadow of his father, Adolf Frederick. While the last monarch had been a passive observer, more known for his excesses and weaknesses than for leadership, Gustav III arrived ready to transform Sweden and restore the power of the crown. From the very beginning, Gustav III understood that to recover lost glory, he had to be much more than a decorative king. With an enlightened education and a reformist spirit, he set out to modernize the state, strengthen royal authority, and, importantly, earn the respect and affection of his people. He knew the path would not be easy, as Sweden had spent decades under the dominant influence of the Riksdag and the nobility, both of whom were used to limiting the power of kings. The key to his strategy was a masterstroke of politics. In 1772, just a year after ascending the throne, he organized a peaceful coup supported by sections of the army and certain political groups. With this action, Gustav III ended the so-called Age of Liberty and largely restored absolute monarchy. The new system, known as the Enlightened Monarchy, combined royal authority with progressive ideas characteristic of the Enlightenment. But Gustav III did not settle for political power alone. He knew that to consolidate his rule, he needed to emotionally connect with his subjects. Thus, he turned the royal court into a top-tier cultural and artistic center. He founded the Royal Opera of Stockholm, promoted theater and music, and invited artists and thinkers from across Europe. His patronage not only elevated Sweden's cultural level, but also served as a way to legitimize his power through beauty and art. However, not everything was an easy victory. The nobility, which had enjoyed decades of influence and privilege, did not look kindly on the restoration of royal power. Resentments and conspiracies grew in the shadows, and Gustav III faced numerous attempts at sabotage. His reign was marked by constant political tensions and careful diplomatic maneuvering to maintain internal stability and Sweden's position on the European stage. He was not merely a monarch, but a strategist who understood that his future depended as much on political cunning as on his ability to connect with the culture and ideas of the time. The tragic death of his father, Adolf Frederick, carried symbolic weight throughout this process. While the former died victim to his gluttony and apparent weakness, Gustav III emerged as the king capable of taking control of both his destiny and that of Sweden. That contrast between the two monarchs became a point of reflection for Swedish society and history itself. Yet the story of Gustav III also has a dark side. His reign came to an abrupt end when he was assassinated in 1792 during a masked ball, the victim of a conspiracy led by discontented nobles. His death marked another critical moment in Sweden, but his legacy endured. The contrast between the reigns of Adolf Frederick and Gustav III illustrates the political, cultural, and social transformations in 18th century Sweden. From a king who died due to his excesses and lack of control, to a leader who fought to reclaim honor and power for the crown, the story of this royal family reflects the challenges of power, human fragility, and the capacity for change. The death of King Adolf Frederick, following a lavish and excessive dinner, became one of the most memorable and discussed episodes in Swedish history. Beyond personal tragedy, the event reflected the social, political, and cultural tensions Sweden was experiencing at the time. The Swedish people, though distant from the extravagances of the court, were surprised by the news that a king had died from what many considered an indulgence. The story of Adolf Frederick quickly became an anecdote, circulating not only in palaces, but also in taverns, a tale with a moral about the dangers of waste and gluttony. Yet Adolf Frederick was also the subject of mockery and criticism from his contemporaries, especially among the nobility and intellectuals. Many saw him as a symbol of monarchical decadence, a king without power or character, devoted to pleasures and lacking the ability to govern. This image was fueled by his unhealthy habits and tragic end, cementing a dark legend that contrasted with the image of great monarchs. On the other hand, his death highlighted the need for reforms in the monarchy and government of Sweden, an issue that his son, Gustav III, took very seriously. The transition toward a stronger, centralized monarchy was also a response to this crisis, an attempt to ensure that Adolf Frederick's fate would not be repeated. Culturally, the reign and death of Adolf Frederick influenced the art, literature, and thought of the era. The story of the gluttonous king became a theme for painters and writers alike, who used his figure to explore themes such as human fragility, decadence, and the necessity of self-control and discipline. The story of Adolf Frederick, the king who died from eating too much, is not just a tale of excess and misfortune. It is a lesson that transcends centuries, becoming an eternal echo resonating in the memory of Sweden and the world. Over the years, his figure has been the subject of analysis, interpretations, and reflections that allow us to understand not only a monarch, but also the risks of decadence, human frailty, and the dangers of apathy in power. Adolf Frederick was undoubtedly a peculiar king. His life and death illustrate how excess, whether of the body or in politics, can be as destructive as any external enemy. His gluttony, so well documented and tragic, symbolizes more than a personal failure. It represents a reflection of the weakness of an institution that had lost its strength and direction. Yet this image should not obscure the fact that Adolf Frederick was also a product of his time. The 18th century was a period of immense political and social change, where absolute monarchies began giving way to more complex and participatory systems. Sweden, in its age of liberty, was undergoing a profound transformation. The crown was no longer the supreme power, but rather one piece on a much larger and more contentious political chessboard. In that context, the figure of Adolf Frederick represents a man who, without the necessary tools or support, became trapped in a symbolic role, condemned to political irrelevance and tempted to take refuge in fleeting pleasures. His death, although shocking, was also a symptom of this crisis. By contrast, his son Gustav III embodied the attempt to redeem the crown and the dignity of the monarchy. Through reforms and a clear political vision, he managed to revive royal authority and restore Sweden's prestige in Europe. This contrast between father and son reinforces the idea that history is a constant struggle between decline and renewal. But what does all this tell us today, more than 2 centuries later? The story of Adolf Frederick reminds us that power is not merely a matter of titles or ceremonies. It is a question of responsibility and purpose. It shows us that indifference, excess, and disconnection from reality can have devastating consequences, not only for individuals, but also for the institutions they represent. Moreover, this story invites us to reflect on human fragility at every level. A king, supposedly invulnerable, dying as a victim of his own gluttony, is a powerful image that speaks to our own vulnerabilities and limits. It reminds us that behind power and authority are people with weaknesses and flaws, and that understanding and self-awareness are essential to avoid tragedy. On a cultural level, the story of Adolf Frederick has inspired numerous works, from paintings depicting him at his final meal to literary accounts and historical studies. His figure has become a symbol of warning and at the same time, a reminder of the humanity behind the throne. In Sweden, his memory has not been forgotten. Beyond mockery or scorn, he has become part of the national identity, a chapter in history that speaks of the dangers of excess and the need for responsible leadership. His death also paved the way for the transformation that allowed Gustav III to restore the monarchy and usher in a new era. Ultimately, the story of Adolf Frederick is a mirror in which we see the consequences of decadence, but also the hope of renewal. It teaches us that even in the darkest moments, history can change through the will and vision of those who dare to lead. Thus, as we remember the king who died from overeating, we are not merely recounting a historical curiosity. We are receiving a living lesson about balance, power, and responsibility. A lesson that remains relevant, echoing in every time and place where excess and indifference threaten to destroy what others have built. And with that thought, we conclude this journey through the life and death of Adolf Frederick, a monarch whose tragic end left an unforgettable legacy, both for Sweden and for the world.